Thank you very much for inviting me to come and speak tonight. And what I'm going to be talking about tonight, I'm going to start talking about what humans do, and in particular, I'm going to be talking about the nature of engagement. And then we'll turn around and look at this problem in terms of human-robot dialogues. And if you're curious why I ever went there from looking at humans, I'll be glad to answer that question. The work that I'm doing is work I'm doing in collaboration with Chuck Rich, who's on the faculty at WPI, and Aaron Holroyd and Brett Ponsler are two graduate students that we work with. So I just want to say a little bit about where we're going. First, I'm going to explain what engagement is, and then I'm going to talk about analysis of human-human dialogues that we've done. After that, I'll define what connection events are as a way to get concrete about engagement. And then I will, for those of you who are techie in the room, talk about a reusable module for the recognition of connection events in interactions. And lastly, I'm going to demonstrate all of this for a robot that plays a pointing game, and you'll get to see what all that's about. So, okay, what's engagement? Engagement is a collaborative process by which two participants establish, maintain, and end their perceived connection to one another. Now, I come from a background in natural language processing. My expertise is in modeling human dialogue and communication. And in the language community, because people are always so focused, at least until very recently, on linguistic behavior, of course, engagement was about talking. But in fact, engagement is a very complicated phenomena, and you just don't do what the language community thinks, which is you say hello, that's the initiation, and then you negotiate the collaboration. That is, you negotiate what you're going to talk about and you talk about it. But in fact, it involves a number of other things, and that's what I want to get us to understand to some extent tonight. Once an engagement process is underway, that is, once you're communicating or doing something together, an important part of that process is checking to see that the other person is still engaged with you, and also deciding if you want to do that too. And if you don't, of course, then you have to end the connection, and there are, of course, more or less graceful ways to do that sort of thing. When you look to see if someone else wants to continue to be engaged, that process involves not only talking, it involves looking, it involves how people use deictic references, that is pointing, it involves mutual facial gaze and so forth. And so we're going to see some of how we've been exploring that tonight. So what's the kind of evidence for engagement that actually happens for human beings? Well, first of all, there's the collaboration. Now, my perspective on human dialogue is that, in fact, all human dialogues are collaborations, because you have to collaborate to actually have the conversation. Even if you're not doing anything more than having a chat after this meeting and eating your cake and kind of entertaining yourself and trying to keep talking to the other person, that's a collaboration. But of course, often our collaborations involve much more than that. They involve us doing some kind of other collaboration, trying to get something done, whether it's a meeting or fixing something on your car, whatever it is. That's a collaboration that's going on. So that's an important evidence for the connection between people. Of course, another effect is conversation management, namely turn-taking. The connection looks like it's breaking down if I say something to you and you don't respond. Now, if we're talking on the phone, we're really in trouble, but even face-to-face, if you don't respond, I then have to look to see what else is going on. So are you still looking at me, or have you gotten distracted by the dog or the kid or whatever, or are you simply staring around the room, whatever the case may be? So in turn-taking itself is another indication of this process. Then there's the whole issue of gaze. There's gaze. We use gaze to take turns, to track objects, to keep track of the attention of the other person. So, you know, one of the many sets of videos that I've looked at that I'm not going to talk much about tonight, I looked at the process by which one speaker makes sure that the other person understands what they're talking about. The speaker was describing objects in a lab and describing new experiments and so forth. And a large part of the problem was, how did that person make sure that the other person understood them? And that involves this whole business about gaze, and to see that the other person is gazing at them at certain points in time. Another, of course, issue is another way we indicate our engagement with someone is through hand gestures. The hand gestures I'm going to talk about tonight have to do with pointing at objects. which is called deictic reference. There were also all kinds of semantic gestures and other things called beat gestures. You'll occasionally see me do things like this or whatever. I talk with my hands a lot, so to speak. I'm not going to say anything about that problem. I think it's an enormously interesting but enormously hard problem. And somewhere in the next decade, I hope someone will make some progress on it, but not yet. Another thing is head gestures. So we use our heads, first of all, to look around. We also use them to nod and shake and tilt our heads to indicate various things. So that's another important aspect of how we express engagement. Body stance is very important. When you're a speaker, of course, you have to face your audience. When you talk to someone else, you largely do, but there are many reasons you can't do that. If I'm washing the dishes, imagine me washing dishes, I'm trying to talk to you, then my body stance is principally to the dishes, and I have to manage and negotiate the process by which I turn and look at you. I think this is pretty neat, and I've been looking for ways to try and experiment and get data on this, and I haven't yet succeeded, although I'll show you in the videos that we were doing how we thought it would happen, but it didn't. Face gestures, another indication of how I'm connected to you is face gestures, and I'll show you one small example of that a little later on. And finally, there are issues about social relationships and cultural norms. The way we indicate that we're engaged with one another can vary tremendously, obviously based on what our cultural circumstances are, but even on the basis of things like power relationships. So the way I indicate I'm engaged with someone who's of higher status than me, or someone who's lower status, is an important variable. So those are all the kinds of things that one can think about. In fact, in my work, I've largely looked at a few things. One is looking in terms of where someone's head actually moves to. And another thing is how people point. And more recently, I've been looking at eye gaze. As it becomes more and more possible to have vision systems that can interpret what's going on with the face, it makes it more possible to look in detail at these things. So in my previous work, I programmed a robot to produce looking gestures, that is to look around to really track closely the face of a particular person who was in front of them, and also to respond to the looking gestures of a person. The way we did that is we were using a very nice piece of software that was developed at MIT called Watson. And Watson made it possible to find somebody's face and then track it as it moved around in 3D. It was a pretty neat program. And in fact, we still use Watson in the work we're doing now. Using that system, I did a study of people using a robot that had gestures where they looked. The robot also talked to the person. That was the other important thing about this. As well as a robot that didn't have any of those gestures. It talked, but it didn't do any of the gestural behavior. And what we found was that people look a lot more, significantly more, at the robot when it's not their turn, when they have the robot that moves. So the robot that's wooden, and the wooden robot basically stood there and it talked, but it never moved its head, it never tracked the gaze of the other person, it never moved around in any way, shape, or form. And we compared that to the robot doing all this kind of very natural looking sort of behavior. And what we discovered was that people really responded significantly in terms of looking when it wasn't their turn. It is the case that when it's your turn, you usually look at the person who you're trying to talk to. So all of my subjects in both conditions, not all, but a very large percentage of them, looked at the robot when they were taking their turn and talking to the robot. But when the robot was talking to them, only in the condition where the robot was doing gestures did they turn back to look at the robot. They kind of wanted to know what was going on. They also reported higher scores in terms of liking the robot, and they interacted for significantly longer times. Okay. The other thing we did was using Watson, and in collaboration with Louis-Philippe Morency, who was the developer of Watson, we developed the capability for Watson to recognize head nods. So if you did this, or you did this little teeny stuff, and it's the little teeny stuff that took us a very long time, then we got the robot to be able to understand nods. And what we discovered was that when the robot understands nods, people produce more nods themselves. So that's a kind of interesting effect. Yes, you can ask questions whenever. It does have a, yes, you have to talk really loudly or the mic won't get it.
What about societies in which the nodding behavior is different? We have an Indian friend who does
Yes.
Yes.
Right. All of my subjects were in an American cultural setting. They were not all Americans. I had several Indian subjects in my subject pool, but they behaved with American signals. So they didn't do this. They did this. So I guess maybe because it was an American lab and they were talking in English and it was sort of an American circumstance, they used American gestures. But obviously, you want to look at these kinds of things for other cultures and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's the kind of thing I started with. And what we were looking at there, of course, was all of these behaviors were about capturing the engagement of the person and having the robot do engagement behaviors. In fact, our robot had some models for what to do when engagement wasn't going well. So for example, if the person did not respond within a reasonable time of their turn, the robot would say something like, "Do you want to continue this discussion?" And when the robot pointed out a particular object that it was talking about, if the person didn't turn and look at that object, then the robot would say, you know, "The thing is here to my right." So it was making use of these kind of things to try and keep the conversation engaging with the human. And of course, it had choices. If you said, "No, I don't want to do it anymore," or if you walked away, the robot, of course, knew that and could respond appropriately. Okay. That said, we can ask the question, how do you know when someone is engaged with you? All those behaviors that I mentioned are indicators of engagement, but it's a very two-sided process. And this is the thing we had to learn about when we were doing the robot stuff. We had to both get the robot to produce engaging behaviors. We also had to develop capabilities so that it could understand it, so it could interpret engagement behaviors. So we'll talk about this in terms of a connection behavior. Suppose person one produces a connection behavior, then person two can acknowledge it in some way, or they can ignore it. So if I look at you, you have the possibility of looking at me, or you can ignore it. And in fact, in the experiments I'm going to talk about, people don't always look at the other person who's looking at them. When someone turns and looks at a subject, it isn't always the case that the other person responds. And that could be for a whole host of reasons. You got something here you're diddling with, you don't actually notice. It's too important, you may actually see out of the peripheral vision that, you know, the other guy's looking at you, but tough, you're busy doing things. You may not be interested enough. We call person one's behavior plus person two response, not when they ignore it, but when they respond, a connection event. And if person two ignores person one's behavior, then we say the event failed. Okay, that's just a simple way to get started. All right, so in the work I'm going to be talking about, we're going to talk about three kinds of connection events. There are obviously a lot more. The first one is adjacency pairs. Adjacency pairs is a term that comes from the work of Harvey Sachs and Manny Shegeloff, work that was done in 1974. They are ethnomethodologists who were interested in looking at giving a very simple kind of low-level account of what goes on in conversations. And for them, an adjacency pair was something said by one person which caused the other person to have to produce some kind of linguistic response. So their paradigmatic example was a question. If I ask a question, the other person gives an answer, that's an adjacency pair. It's a little harder to tell what the story is about all the other ways we talk in conversation, but nonetheless, it's a nice basic model. In our work, we extended the notion of adjacency pairs to include various kinds of nonverbal responses. Why? Well, one of the ways that you respond to what someone says is you go, uh-huh. And sometimes you go without saying, uh-huh. In fact, in my studies, about 8% of the time, people actually don't verbalize the uh-huh or yes, they just do the nod, okay? So we wanted to be able to include that as the response to the initial part of an adjacency pair. Another thing is an action. If I tell you to pick up the bottle, and you pick it up and you don't say anything else, that's clearly an adjacency pair. You've got an event, a linguistic event, and then not a linguistic event, but nonetheless a response to that linguistic event. And finally, Sometimes what counts is the facial expression. If I tell you, you look really great today, and you give me a great big smile, I don't have to get anything else out of you, and I know that event has been completed. The other thing we did was allow for various types of third and fourth turn pairs as part of adjacency pairs. In Saxon-Schegeloff's original work, they had a notion that you could have a start of an adjacency pair have some kind of intermediate question, for example, something like, you know, how big is the elephant on the corner? And the other person could say, do you mean the green elephant or the red elephant? And then the first person would say, you know, the green elephant, and then you'd have the final thing. Now that's a four pair, that's two turns to make that actually happen, so that's a 4-turn sequence as an adjacency pair. And they also allowed for 3-turn ones. We've carried that pretty strongly through in the work that we've done because, in fact, we've seen cases where it really was the case that people not only asked questions of clarification, but they did other kinds of things as well. So we thought it was pretty important to be clear about that. And we also include in adjacency pair back channels. Back channels is the, if I say to you something fairly long and along the way you just nod your head, then we took that as an indication, a nonverbal indication that you were in fact responding to the adjacency pair. Okay, so that's one kind of thing. A second kind of behavior that we are looking at is directed gaze. Directed gaze comes in two forms. It comes in the form of my looking at something, so I'm directing my gaze with the intention of getting you to look at the same thing. So if I look at Bill's bottle with the microphone on top. And the other way, of course, is what I actually did just then, which is I used my hand to kind of point at it as well as my face. It's almost always the case that when we point at things, we actually look too. There are exceptions. You've probably all had the experience of being in a museum or somewhere where there's been a tour guide who said, back there, and without turning around and looking at it, they point at something and tell you what it is, like the mountain or this painting or whatever. But for the most part, people actually look and point at the same time, and that's because it's pretty hard to get your pointing to be accurate if you don't direct your face as well as your hand at the same time. Okay. There are lots of other possible connection events. Touch may be a form of connection event. You know, I touch you and you respond to that sort of thing. It's possible that emotions are. But the three I've just mentioned are the ones that we've been actually, oh, I forgot to mention mutual facial gaze. That's the one where I look at you and then you look back at me. Okay. So, in order to get a little clearer about all this, and obviously as I've been talking about it, I have been, we did a human-human study at WPI. It was pairs of people, 8 pairs, each 2 people, so across the table from each other in a 15-minute session. And at the beginning, we started with an instructor who was a Confederate. He knew about the experiment. And he taught a participant, the student, how to make canopies, you know, little kind of appetizers on crackers. After that, the student became the instructor, not knowing anything more than they were supposed to do the same thing with a second participant. And we videotaped all these sequences, and we've done a lot of annotation of them. So what I want to do is, first is I want to show you a little bit of making canopies video. And there's a couple things you should notice, and one is that the instructor points a lot. And the reason the instructor does that is he's got a lot of stuff that's spread out on the table that he's got to be able to tell the other person about, and which the other person doesn't know about at the beginning. You'll also notice that he makes various kinds of what are called iconic and metaphoric gestures. So he puts his hands up and, you know, does movements like this, and those are what I call the semantic gestures. And so you'll see that he does that kind of thing as well. So let me bring up the video. First I have to find it. Oh yeah. Oh, there it is. Okay, so what you're seeing actually is two videos. That is, we had two cameras that we videotaped. These are time synced in a system called Elan, which we use for doing our analysis. And I've just taken a cut from that particular thing. So what you'll see in in this camera, this is the student. So you're seeing it from the point of view of being able to see what the teacher is actually doing. And on this side, you get to see what the student is doing, and that they're exactly time synced. Come on, thing.
It is sort of what you see at sort of a scale function with how that plays in sort of like a reserve type thing. And so they start off with crackers, followed by normally the frequency cheese for hummus. And then we put on a smaller topping, such as Mentos or olives or raisins or something like that. And then they're sort of put onto a plate in some sort of a fancy orientation, and they're served for them. What is that? Those go in the presentation of the plates.
Okay. The student asked at the end, he asked, what were the plates, what is the plate for? And the teacher turns to the red plate that you can see right here. In fact, the reason we had the red plate over there is I was trying to get some data on people having to be turned away from the other person and doing something while they talked to the other person. Turned out that didn't work, but nonetheless. What you should have noticed is, one, the teacher, this young man here, does a lot of pointing, but he doesn't do what I just did a whole lot. He mostly does other kinds of pointing. So he does what are called half taps or open taps, and he sometimes does this kind of tap as well. So he does a lot of different kinds of things to indicate what's going on in front of him. So it's not simply this kind of point. There's several variations of hand movements that he actually does.
You said he was a setter. Did he do that? Was he coached?
No, he just knew that, he was going to be teaching people about this stuff. He knew that that there was all the stuff that he had to pay attention to and why we were getting the data. He was not told how to point, how to do any of that stuff. He was just busy trying to explain to his fellow student what it was that they were supposed to be learning. And in fact, in the subsequent video, when this young man takes over and does the video, he also does a fair amount of pointing. And that's because we set up the circumstances right. Namely, there were a lot of objects that had to be used in the experiment, and they had to be explained what it was they were. So it's a circumstance that kind of encouraged people to actually use those kinds of behaviors so we could understand what it looked like. Oh yes, in fact, I promised to show you an example, and I forgot to do it, of, and I'll show it to you now, of the circumstance where someone actually uses emotion. Oops, I have to go very far. You can see emotion, you can see not emotion, but a facial expression as the response to what someone says. So watch this for a second.
Candidates sort of wasn't ability to observe that some of the sort of example or function one, so we don't have that one trait and stuff. So one thing that we do, to start off, basically we start with the cracker, followed by either cream cheese or hummus based type of thing.
Okay, so that's the thing I wanted you to see, is that just before that, when the first thing he said it was a cracker, it's very hard to catch these things. I've spent a good part of my life looking at nodding, and I now see nods all over the place. He actually did a little tiny nod of his head, the student saying, yeah, cracker, as his response. When we get to the other part, he does this wonderful facial expression. So it's kind of fun to see those things occur. All right. Okay, so now you get a sense of the data that we've actually been looking at. What we've done is take all of those videotapes and annotate them using the Elan system. There have been two annotators, myself and a student, and we've annotated a huge number of things. Head direction, eye gaze, what's being pointed at, body position, speech. We had to transcribe all the speech. responses to pointing, mutual facial gazes, all of those kinds of things. Okay. Here's maybe a little cleaner picture. So here's a moment or a set of moments in this kind of annotation software. You can see there's the instructor head. You probably can't read this. Left hand of the instructor, right hand. God, I can't even read this. Body, eyes, the student head, and so forth. And we lay out exactly what is going on in all of those cases. And the nice thing about this wonderful annotation tool is once you do all that, it will collect a lot of interesting statistics for you pretty much by saying, I want a this and this, and it will set it all up for you. So it's a really wonderful piece of technology. Okay, now I mentioned directed gaze and mutual facial gaze, et cetera. I'm now going to give you a kind of definition of this in picture form, okay? So directed gaze, in terms of what it actually looks like in an experience is like this. And then it starts with the initiator doing a directed gaze movement. And at some point, this is gaze, and this is not facial gaze, this is the pointing kind of stuff. So at some point, the initiator gazes at something, and optionally, that's what these little hatched marks mean, they may actually point at something. So somewhere after they start looking to gaze, they can also point. And then at some point, if the connection event succeeds, the responder will actually gaze at whatever it is that's being pointed at. Okay, and that response can actually happen after the initiator has both stopped looking and stopped pointing. There can be these kinds of delays. More typically, in fact, they'll be overlapped in some way, but that's a possibility. And we talk about this part as being the delay and then the shared gaze moments in time. Okay, that's shared gaze. Mutual facial gaze is a little simpler. The initiator gazes at the other person's face, of course, and then optionally they may stop and the other person finally may respond. It's possible that, in fact, there is overlap so that the initiator gaze time is actually longer. And again, this is delay, and this is when the mutual facial gaze happens. Adjacency pairs, you may have got a sense of this, but I'll go through it anyway. The initiator says something, and then there's a response by the other person. Now, it is the case that, as we all know, communication is not well-formed or well-behaved all the time. It's possible that, in fact, the initiator starts their contribution and the responder starts theirs before the first person ends. That creates a very interesting kind of tension in the interaction, but nonetheless, it does happen. And then, of course, I wanted to allow for the third turn and fourth turn possibilities, and so they're kind of shown here optionally. In a third turn case, this is the third case, and then, of course, you could also see a response by the responder and then another turn by the initiator. So adjacency pairs is, in fact, possibly very simple because it's, statement response or some kind of communication response, but in fact, it can go on past that. Okay. And finally, there are back channels. In a back channel, the initiator has some contribution, and somewhere in the middle of it, you get a back channel. Most back channels are of the form this, but they also come with ahas. They're usually said at a very low volume. Okay, so now we're going to talk about what we've been trying to get a handle on, which is the time between connection events. And we're interested in the time between connection events because, in fact, if you're going to build a robot that's going to do these things, it has to know how to do it appropriately. And appropriately is getting a response that makes sense within the rhythm of the conversation. So we've defined connection events as the time between the start of successive events. And that's because it may well be that there's an adjacency pair that's going on at the same time there's mutual facial gaze, or at the same time there's pointing. And so we want to be able to have a sense of how all of these things play together. Our hypothesis is that the mean time between connection events captures the notion of pace informally that happens in an interaction. So pace essentially is 1 over the mean time between connection events. That is, the faster the pace, the less time there is between connection events. And I actually see this in the videos of human subjects. When they're talking about the materials that they're using, there's a lot of back and forth. If the instructor is explaining things, you see a lot of head nods on the part of the other person. They look back at the person. Things go along pretty quickly. Then later in the interaction, when they're actually making the canopies, things are much more attenuated. So the pace of the conversation changes. And so that's what we figured would in fact go, that's what we observed, and so we wanted a way to be able to talk about that. And so that's what mean time between connection events captures. Okay. Now, another thing that we've wondered about is whether increasing the mean time between connection events means that there's a weakening of the engagement process. If we're having a conversation and at some point the conversation kind of slows down and you think for a while before you say anything, or you simply don't respond very fast, that's an indication that the engagement process is kind of weakening, maybe the whole interaction may be ending. But what's interesting about the videos that we collected is that there are very long periods of time, that is, the mean time between connection events is very, very long. And in fact, they haven't stopped engaging in one sense with one another, still doing the task of making canopies, but they're less engaged with one another. And the reason is they're sitting there making their canopies. And when you're busy doing that, each person, you don't have to say something. And in this particular case, these students don't know each other well to do social dialogue with one another, so they simply make their canopies, and there's a lot less communication that goes on at that point in time. So the dilemma, from my point of view, is, well, are they less engaged with one another? Or should we count the process of doing a task as you're doing the tasks that are part of your contribution to the task? Should they count somehow as part of the engagement process? Yeah?
In another context, I heard that when people are interacting, sometimes with very high-speed imaging, you can see that people have micro gestures that give away their inner feelings and senses that are not being stated.
Yeah.
Are you trying to look for that kind of thing?
No. So the question, if you can't hear it, is about microgestures. If you look in high-speed film, you'll often see very interesting microgestures that are going on between people. You were also asking why I'm not looking at that?
Well, maybe, but is that an area to explore with humans?
Oh, yes, I think it is. And part of the reason is that we're able to see all that stuff. I mean, human vision is really, really good at a certain distance, of course. I mean, I probably can get that for Rich, but I probably can't for the lady sitting in the back of the room. But at a fairly close range, we're amazingly sensitive to faces and to all kinds of micro movements of the face, all the little muscles moving and all that kind of stuff. We're pretty sensitive to. One of the things I haven't looked at so far is eyebrow raises, for example. They convey a certain amount of information. Paul Ekman, who's a famous psychologist who's done work on modeling models of emotions in faces, claims that he can tell about deception from the human face because there's this one particular muscle somewhere up here that apparently we can't control. And if you're lying, it does a certain thing that it otherwise doesn't. Okay, I'll believe that. I don't know if it's really true. I've never looked at any of this stuff carefully enough, but if that's true, we were really paying attention to pretty subtle things. So micro movements could, in fact, be pretty important. It is the case that I have looked a little bit at the problem of how people move their eyes around. So it turns out normally you can get to about 15 degrees before you actually need to move your head in order to deal with glances and stuff. So from here you can go a little bit. That's kind of a stretch to be able to see over to that table from me if I'm holding my head that way. But the glances that we do, we do pay attention to a fair amount. We don't pay attention to them as far as I can tell if they're very fast. I did a study in which I looked at looking behavior, and if people look away for very short periods of time, less than a second, it looks like the other person doesn't track it. But longer stuff they obviously do. So, okay. So one of the things we did as a result of doing all that data analysis is we started looking at summary statistics for engagement maintenance. And this is one pair, 9 minutes. It's the very first set of subjects. And we can look at, in fact, what it is they were doing. Maybe I should go over here for a change to keep these people interested. So first of all, we get to see how many successes and failures there were. Directed gaze, and most of the directed gaze cases involved pointing, but not all of them. There were 13 of them that succeeded and only one that failed. So in this circumstance, people paid attention to pointing. It really mattered to them, so they paid attention to it. The minimum delay time was nothing. That is, as soon as the other person started doing the other thing, the other person was responding. The maximum time was 2 seconds. The means, obviously, somewhere in the middle between there. Mutual facial gazes, well, there were a lot of them, 24 altogether. About half of them succeeded and half of them failed. So, as I said, we'd always pay attention to when somebody else looks at us. Adjacency pairs. A successive adjacency pair is when the other person responded. There are 30 of those, but there are a surprising number where the student, mostly it was the student, sometimes the instructor was having to respond to something the student said. There are a surprising number of those that didn't have responses. I was really amazed that there were so many times that the instructor would say something to the student and there was absolutely no response, no head movement, nothing that indicated they were responding. Rich?
How do you get a time to no response?
Um,
There's a delay of 1.2 seconds between an adjacency pair where somebody says something and you get no response to it. I don't understand what the time is. Adjacency pair failed.
Yes, the adjacency pair failed, so why do we have a mean maximum time? That's a really, nobody's ever asked me that question before. Oh yes, I'm measuring from the start. That's why. Yeah, it's from the start to the next thing that was going on. So there would be some other activity that would take over at that point. So you get a piece of that. That's why. Also, back channels. There are a fair number of back channels, and of course we don't have delays for them because they don't make sense. All right. So. The mean time between connection events is a little over 5.5 seconds. And the maximum time is 70 seconds. And that covers those long periods where they were busy doing something and somebody said something, somebody responded, and the next connection event was a long, long time away. Okay, so you can see this is a huge variance over what the means actually were. Yeah. She wanted to know what it means for a back channel. A back channel is the response you give in the middle of my conveying some kind of information. So if I'm talking, you just did one. If I'm talking to you about something and you're interested in conveying that you're like getting the message and you're interested in what I'm saying, then you will do head nods, sometimes accompanied by ahas or yeses. I have a feeling that this is a term due to Manny Shegoloff. I'm not sure, but I think he's the one who originally coined that term. I forget who originally came up with that term. Yeah, right. Yeah. But, I mean, for people who think of communication as there's a channel of information that's going one way, then the back channel is kind of, I'm responding, but I'm not responding when it's my turn. I'm kind of doing this while it's still your turn. That's the trick about back channels, is they can happen. I haven't got the floor when I back channel, but I'm assisting the conversation going along. And I'll take your question. And somebody over here had, Doug, you had one. I'll get back to you.
That sounds like a term from the old radio days when you could transmit but not receive at the same time.
Right. Yes. In fact, it's kind of interesting. He said that it sounds like an old term, a term from the old radio days when you could transmit but not receive. That may, in fact, be what it was that people had in mind by saying, look, it's the other person's turn, and you're not actually allowed to talk when it's their turn, but you can do this kind of other tricky thing in the middle of their turn. And I've made the whole process of turn-taking sound simple. It's, in fact, probably one of the hardest problems in dialogue is to come up with some reasonable model of how turn-taking actually works, because it's amazingly variable. So, Doug, you had a question.
Well, I was just going to ask, if there's a failure, is there a retry typically, or?
Sometimes when people fail, they will retry. I mean, if I need you to pick up that thing and you don't respond, I may, in fact, say to you again, that one right there. So it's possible that, you can get retries of adjacency pairs. You can get retries of facial expressions, all kinds of things. I mean, there are reasons to repeat things. There are also reasons not to bother. And in fact, it's interesting. I didn't think to look at, and maybe I will go back and look in the data to see how many times somebody retries their adjacency pair, for example. It's a little harder to tell about mutual facial gaze if it's a retry or you're just doing it the next time, for example. And also, of course, directed gaze, you can again see whether when somebody responds, if they don't, does the person try again? So there are a couple of cases where we could actually learn some of that. Okay, we used this kind of data, I mentioned all this stuff, to look at a setting which we wanted to explore with a robot. By the way, the reason I got interested in robots as a device for natural language understanding is because you get to control the robot ultimately. You can look at human data for a long time, but you can't make humans, you can't control them in any way, shape, or form. They get to do their own thing. And in fact, in one set of experiments that I did when I submitted a paper about the work, one of the reviewers said, well, look, your control group should have been an actor, acting the part of the robot. And I was like, you don't get it, because you really can't get people to do perfect control of things, or at least you'd have to have a really unusually skilled actor to make it not blink and not all these, If you wanted an actor who could act like my robot, he would have to not blink his eyes, for example, because the robot didn't have eyes that could blink. And all of those things matter in the communication. So I was interested in having a device where I could really control what it was that was going on. And that is what led me to look at robots. Yes, ma'am? Say that again louder.
The robots need to be in line of sight.
Yes. Right. No, my robot has to be in line of sight with the person, and I'll show you why when you get to see what the robot actually looks like. It has to do with cameras. And also, at the moment, our robots do fairly little speech recognition, because speech recognition for conversation is astonishingly terrible. So one of the challenges in having any kind of interaction with a robot is how to do it so that the robot has a chance of interpreting what the person actually said. And the reason for that is that even if you try and constrain what people say, and they get kind of good at it, they forget. If they're engaged with the robot, they will say the most amazing things. So in the original study I told you about, we told people the robot can understand hello, goodbye, yes, no, please repeat, and your name. That's it. If you say anything else, it will ask you, I didn't understand that, please repeat. Okay. Mostly that worked really well in the interactions, and these were fairly long interactions. These were 5-6 minutes, so the robot would talk about things and ask questions that were yes, no kind of questions. But occasionally things would happen like 3/4 of the way through the conversation, the robot would say, do you want me to explain why this object is important? And one person said, no, I think I got that all figured out, so you don't have to. And I'm like, I don't believe they actually said that. Another time in one of the conversations, the robot says, this device was invented by Paul Dietz. Do you know Paul Dietz? And one guy says, Paul Dietz? Who's Paul Dietz anyway? And I'm like, okay, you didn't get it, you know. And that's because once people are involved, I guess, in an interaction with a robot and it stops seeming kind of stilted and all that sort of stuff, then they forget this constraint which says, you know, I told you there's 6 things you could say to the robot, and their natural inclination is to say what they want to say. And if you let people say what they want to say, we will say just about anything you can imagine. And that doesn't work very well with speech systems. So that's one of our challenges in all this work. Yes, sir. Oh, and I won't say anything about prosody because prosody is such a difficult problem for speech recognition. And it's because, as we all know, HMMs are local phenomena and speech and prosody is a long-distance phenomena. So I'm really interested in the problem of prosody, but I can't get a speech system to do anything with it. I and other people have looked at interesting problems in prosody, and it will happen, but just not yet. So, yeah, one more question.
What if you invented a language where you only told the person 6 words in that language? I mean, invented it, because I couldn't say it. Human being. That would be great.
It's really, really hard to get people to use invented languages. And the reason is they either have to be totally outside of the realm of your own language. So, you know, like, you know, what's the language that people learn from Star Trek for the, yeah, Klingon, yeah. If it's Klingon, maybe you could come up with a Klingon-like language, and it's so different that they wouldn't, you know, revert to English. If you use some subset of English, the problem is always finding the boundaries for the subset.
No, I think Urdu or Japanese or some language that you don't know. You don't even know what yes, no, hello, goodbye are because you have a cheat card.
Yes, and that is one alternative that people have tried, which is to have a cheat card. In the work I've done so far, I've been unwilling to give people devices that will distract them from the interaction. So you give somebody a cheat card, and then they got to look at it instead of having the interaction they're going to have. So
Put it on top of the robot's head, like that.
there you go. That's one I hadn't thought of, Elizabeth.
The robot has
Right, that's the other problem. Yeah.
so the human is getting lulled by that. If
Yes,
it's
right.
hard, if the robot talks like it's hard to Jane,
Yeah.
human is probably
Right, right. But if the robot talks like me, Tarzan, you, Jane, that's no better for some speech recognition system because that's not what most speech recognition systems do. So it's still a very difficult problem. So in this work, what happens is the robot will say in the setting we're talking about, so this is the pointing game. The robot and the person have objects in front of them, and the robot can point at things. So can the human. And the robot can recognize head nods and head shakes. It doesn't actually have to do any in this particular experiment, but nonetheless, he can recognize them. And he says things like, please point in an object. And the person can nod their head and shake their head. And if the person says anything, that's fine. It's just that the robot, in this case, doesn't understand at all. It's just noisy signal. And the only thing in this setting we're making use of is the fact that the person said something. So they are, in fact, responding at that point. Okay, so that's a fairly simple kind of situation. And what we have done is build a software module, a reusable one. So in the programming community, people are really serious about sharing their stuff on SourceForge. In fact, this particular software module is done as a set of ROS messages. And ROS is an architecture that has been developed by Willow Garage, who are one of the companies that they are angel funded by one of those rich guys from Microsoft. I forget which one, for the next 10 years. And they have several robots. In fact, they're about to give 10 of them away to universities around the country and around the world for experimentation. But they've developed this architecture, and so we've built our software module to work as part of their ROS message architecture. And this architecture implements engagement recognition. So this is the problem of how you recognize that, in fact, engagement is happening on basis of what the person actually does. And we want a set of generic algorithms that are independent of lots of software details and are independent of an application. So that's a pretty big order of business. Now, we originally had, in the original work I did, a set of algorithms, but they were kind of hacked together and thrown together, and so we're trying to extrapolate from that and get something that's reliable over and over. The engagement process also requires a set of generation algorithms because, of course, the robot not only has to recognize the engagement that is coming in from the human, as well as keeping track of its own recognition of engagement of the person, but also the robot's going to have to generate engagement behaviors. But at the moment, the piece that we're focused on is just getting the recognition problem settled down properly. Okay. The overall architectural picture, for those of you who like this sort of thing, is this. The robot has a bunch of cognitive capabilities. We are not making statements about what that is. They include sensors and various kinds of actuators, because the robot has arms, and our robot has arms and has a face and eyes and all that sort of thing. And what we're looking at is what things come in from the human in terms of gaze, points, nods, and shakes. What the robot cognition tells us about what the robot's own engagement goals ought to be, and what the state of the floor is and how it's changed. And also what the robot is doing. So this module has to know from the rest of the robot, did the robot gaze at something, point at something, do a head nod, head shake, etc. And what it's doing is it's producing some information for the rest of the architecture, namely what the results were of the robot's goals. So if the robot produced some kind of pointing, did in fact that succeed? And also a kind of continual updating of the engagement statistics, namely, what's going on with the mean time between connection events. And the reason this is so important, this statistic, is that will tell the robot, aha, the person did something, and now I have a limited amount of time to respond back to that in order to keep the pace of the conversation going. Or the robot produced a behavior, and if the human doesn't respond within a certain period of time, that's an indication of something about the engagement process changing. So that's why these statistics are going to be critical for this module to produce.
What are floor changes?
Huh? What are floor changes? Thank you. A floor change is when you take a turn in the conversation. Okay? I have the floor and then you have the floor. Okay? And we use the term floor change here because it's one of the parts of the whole process of managing turns. So there's really two things going on when we have a conversation and we're taking turns. I initiate a segment, a piece of the conversation, and in that initiation, I'm sort of in control of the interaction. You may take a turn because I may finish my statement and be looking at you, and that means, okay, it's your turn to take the conversation over. You have control. You then get to control the floor, but I control the interaction as a whole, and I decide when it's done, essentially. So there's two processes going on. There's one giving the floor back and forth, and then there's one which is kind of ending the whole part of the interaction. And so we want to be able to account for both of those things. But floor changes is just the part of who's got the floor now. Okay. All right. Now, so I said something about the input to the engagement recognition. This is information on where the human points, where they look, and that's because we want to recognize when the human-initiated connection events actually happen. And we also want to recognize when they complete, because if they don't complete, that's pretty important. We also want to know information about where the robot looks. And that's because the robot has to recognize that it's completing its part of a human-initiated connection event. So the robot has to essentially know about its own processes as well. The inputs to engagements are also engagement goals, because we have to know when to begin waiting for a human response. And finally, we have to know about when the floor changes, so that we can know whether it's our turn to talk or the other person's turn to talk. Okay, that's the basic picture. And as I said, engagement recognition provides information about whether the connection event succeeded or failed, and also statistics in terms of a sliding window, so we know what the current pace is. And so also we can tell whether, if the current pace slows down a lot, then there's information that suggests, oh, maybe this person doesn't want to do this anymore. And in fact, when we start looking at things like the pointing game is only so interesting for so long, so it really is a circumstance where people kind of have had enough. Okay. I actually am not going to go through the details of this architecture since it's getting a little late. But as you can see, what we have is we have different recognizers for each one of the kinds of connection events, and then an integrator for that capability. Okay, these are the details of the actual recognizers. I'm going to spare us that this evening. All right, so now I want to demonstrate the pointing game. I'm going to demonstrate the original work that was done on this. This was done by a couple of students at WPI. One of them, Brett, is right there. And what you'll get to see is how Melvin does this. Now, this is Melvin. He is a humanoid robot. He stands about this tall. He has 2 degrees of freedom in his neck, so he can turn his neck this way and that way and up and down. He has eyes that are googly eyes. They go back and forth and up and down. His eyebrows go up and down. He has a mouth. Well, you'll get to see his mouth move. That's the best way I can explain it. He has 2 degrees of freedom in each shoulder, and he has 2 degrees of freedom in his arm. Okay. We actually have more than 2. We can do this and that, but we can also do this interesting turny thing, and we did not build that into our robot. He's mobile. You won't see him doing any of that today. He runs on a Pioneer 2 mobile base, for those of you who love those kinds of details. Now, in the video that I'm going to show you, the other thing is this is a stereoptic camera. He uses this for vision, for looking at the other person and seeing the person's head nods and head shakes. There's also a camera in the ceiling, and that's the camera you will see produced here. And that camera is used for catching the person's hand and noticing what his own hands are doing, and also for being able to find these nice brightly colored objects, which are plates. We are not interested in doing hairy, interesting vision work, and so we've cheated wherever we can to make the vision problem for this kind of object recognition stuff easy. The stuff like head nods and head shakes we've taken much more seriously because it's a problem we're interested in. Okay, quick video. Get this out of the way. There's Melvin. Oh, I know. No. Oh, okay. All right, so here's Melvin. There'll be sound in a second.
Hello, my name is Melvin. Let's play the pointing game.
Now you can see what he does with his lips. Okay. Oh, you want me to make it bigger? Good point. Thank you.
You pointed to the orange plate. Please point again.
Before he goes on, one of the things you should have noticed is that time he actually follows the person's hand and stuff. The very first time out, he didn't. We did that so you could see the difference between kind of really very natural behavior and something that's a little more wooden. Okay.
You pointed at the orange plate. Please point again.
He's doing something weird there. Notice he didn't look where his finger pointed.
You pointed at the blue plate. Please point again.
This is so we aren't cheating.
You pointed at the orange plate. Please point again.
Okay.
Okay, thank you for playing.
All right. So that video was made in last spring. It was an undergraduate student project. These guys did an incredible amount of work to get that all to work. It was one huge state machine, which mixed up everything. All the engagement rules, all this stuff, everything they tried was completely mixed up. The video I'm going to show you in a minute is in observable behavior virtually identical. It's a little weaker on engagement generation, and the guys who did this work are now working on a much more sophisticated version of the pointing game, which has the recognition module and an almost generalized generation module. And it's done, as I said, as a ROS recognition module. And let me show you what that one looks like. And you will see that it's a little different. Hello. Oh, here we go. Oh, something funny happened. Go away thing. Thanks, full screen. Okay. Go. Maybe we're not going to see this. Oh, here we go. I lied. I'm not sure why that isn't working, but I guess you're not going to get to see that tonight. Oh well. You'll just have to believe me that it's close. But the important thing is what we did in terms of some statistics. So we ran a small experiment with about 5 subjects doing the pointing game, and we looked at the behavior of our subjects, okay, in terms of directed gaze and mutual facial gaze and all that stuff, essentially to compare with that table that I showed you before. So there's a lot of directed gaze, 69 instances of it. A lot more of them fail. Remember, the last time it was 1. This time there are a lot of failures. And we think that's because the robot, of course, doesn't always get pointing very accurately. And sometimes when he points, the other person doesn't actually look. Mutual facial gaze, it's a little less balanced than it was in the human-human case, but kind of interesting. Adjacency pairs, well, the adjacency pairs here are a little different because, of course, when the person says something, we don't actually know what they said, and so we end up most of what goes on is head nods and head shakes. Nonetheless, there are a fair number that succeed as well as some that fail. Now, if we look at the mean time between connection events, it's very different. First of all, the mean time is 3 seconds versus almost 5.5, and the maximum time is not very big at all. And that's because the pointing game just happens. You know, you point, you point, you point. It goes by kind of like the parts of our human-human studies where people are actually getting told about the objects and so on and so forth. But there's nothing in the pointing game that's the equivalent of making canapes. So in fact, we don't see maximum times that are very large. So it's kind of interesting to see how these things line up. Okay, I'm going to finish up here. So what have we been doing here? Well, we've studied something about the nature of engagement behaviors in human participants. We've defined various types of connection events and shown how that they're indicators of engagement. We've been developing an architecture that clarifies how the role of engagement recognition operates with respect to the rest of the human-robot system. And we are now in the process of extending that to generation. And we've created this module, recognition module, that's available in ROS. For those of you who have a robot, you can go to the ROS Willow Garage site, and you can actually download our module if you like that sort of thing. So, what's next? One thing is more data analysis. When you have data like I've got, boy, you can spend forever on it, and I've been doing that. In my voluminous free time, I've been collecting lots more information about connection events and how long they take and so forth. We're going to be doing some more extensive human-robot studies to evaluate the recognition module. That's work that's going to be going on this summer. There are other issues engagement that we're interested in. So I mentioned this issue about, is parallel activity, I'm doing my part, you're doing your part, is that a weak form of engagement? What should we do about that? How should we take care of that? The other question I raised a little earlier was, what other kinds of behaviors signal engagement, and how do we want to try and capture that? Should we be thinking about that, given that the sensory capabilities of a robot are still not very sophisticated? And finally, I'm kind of interested in the question about engagement in terms of scale. So should we be looking at things in terms of seconds between things? Should we be looking at some kind of gross measure of what constitutes engagement? And finally, the modules that we built, I didn't show to them in detail, but they're very much state machines. And an interesting question is how we might represent uncertainty in those kinds of models. Robot sensing is remarkably uncertain. Not only is speech uncertain, but vision is uncertain as well. And so and also human behavior is, of course, somewhat unpredictable. So there's an interesting question about whether we might try using some kind of Markov chain to model that sort of thing. So, and finally, as I mentioned, we're working on a generation module too. Okay, that's it. I'm happy to take more questions, although you've asked lots and I've really enjoyed it. Thank you. Yes, yes. We originally had hoped that we would just build the robot to be able to make canapes. Turns out that's really hard because the language problems are really complicated. The robot has hands, but they're just like this. I don't know if you noticed when he put his hands down in front of the table. This is what his hands are. He doesn't have grippers. We did that originally when we had the robot made for us because the number of degrees of freedom you get in hands is enormous, and the problems you get in keeping the hardware working is astonishing. So that's the reason and also I figured if we just had a hand and at least did this, we could point like this, there is a way to get the robot to kind of turn so you can do something like that, even though you can't do this and you have to turn its body in a different way. But we figured we could get a lot of pointing gestures without having to do all the manipulation things. But that makes the manipulation problems really quite challenging. So I still would like to see if we couldn't do a version of the canopy problem, that is, where you have to teach in some way. Now, obviously, we could get the robot to be the teacher and just have the person do all the smearing stuff on crackers and things like that. But we couldn't actually do the sort of two-stage canopy making that we did in the human-human case. Yeah. There's a lot of work going on in the HRI community using Wizard of Oz stuff. I personally hate it. And it's because until you actually have a robot has to do what a robot's got to do, and you're not kind of getting this person behind the screen, making the whole problem easier. You're not really seeing what the real phenomena are. So there are lots and lots of experiments with that, and every once in a while I see a Wizard of Oz experiment with with the robot that I think is really quite credible, but a lot of them just strike me as having, made the problem so straightforward you can't really tell what it means. But if you go to Nature Eye conference, you'll see lots of those. So it's an interesting matter. Other questions? That?
Slightly more interesting task, but so simple. You put the raisin under the cup and move the cups around. Could the robot follow that? Could it do that?
Well, that's an interesting question. It'd have to be a pretty big raisin. It'd probably have to be more like a yellow ball or something like that. Yes, I think that might be possible. Again, it would be, it's a different problem. It's not about pointing per se, and it's not very conversational in any sense. It's another kind of trick, but it's an interesting thing to think about, and I certainly will think about it in terms of some student projects. We're always trying to get students to come up with things to do. So.
And the reason was moving the plates down.
Right. Well, but the reason he was moving plates around was just so you could see that there was no cheating going on. Okay? You move them here, you move them there. And when in fact, the robot, while all that's going on, isn't really doing very well at tracking that stuff because it was actually moving pretty fast. And the vision recognition algorithms for objects, or even with color, don't move that quickly. But what we wanted to show is that, it isn't like we cheated and the robot knew where the plates were, the particular colored plates. So yes, sir.
In terms of,
Yeah.
in terms of maintaining engagement and maintaining evidence of engagement,
Mhm.
and the new time between events
Right.
starts to grow longer,
Right.
we shift to different strategies for recovery. Think about having the robot do that. More and more instructions. Try to get that feedback.
I think this really, I've looked at this problem a little bit. I did a set of studies when I was in Mitsubishi of people who came to the lab and who were shown various equipment and experiments around the lab. So this is, again, human data. And there were interesting challenges occasionally with some of the humans who came to visit in terms of whether they actually looked at the other person, okay? And so you got what looked like this visitor really wasn't interested in the experiment in terms of mutual facial gaze, but they did the other thing. So if the person, the host in the laboratory pointed to things, the visitor looked at that sort of thing and nodded their head appropriately, even though they weren't looking at the host. So there is an interesting question in my mind. If you simply don't perform on one of the channels, namely something like mutual facial gaze, and everything else is going all right, seems to me then it's still an engagement process. It's just that there's something kind of funny happening. But there are other times that might not be true. So if you and I are having a conversation, and while you're talking, I'm over here looking like this, after a while, you are going to wonder what is going on. And if I do that, and when it's my turn to talk, I'm still wandering over here, and then finally I go, well, okay, and then I finally have something to say. Then somehow we've kind of crossed some boundary between being engaged and starting to have a very attenuated engagement circumstance. And depending on what your goals are, you may decide, I don't really want to talk to this person anymore, she's not worth it. Or you may decide, I'm going to have to do something to get your interlocutor, namely me, more involved. In fact, in my human data, the host in that circumstance, unbeknownst to him, what he did was he shook the object a bunch. He kept looking at this guy. He did all these amazing things at a much higher rate than he did with his other visitors. And it's because he was actually trying to solve this problem, which is to get the person to look at him. So that's a very interesting, this very interesting question is, what are the strategies we use and when do we use those strategies? And I haven't tried to tease that apart yet. I think it's a challenging problem because it kind of has to get you inside somebody's head a certain amount. I'm not sure how to do that yet. So, yes, ma'am.
What is the ultimate purpose? What is the ultimate purpose of having a human interact with a robot such that the robot can read the human in a certain way?
Oh, this is the classic question. We're going to have robots. In fact, I often joke that my work is going to make it possible for a robot to keep me company when I'm a little old lady, which isn't all that far away, but nonetheless it will happen. It is the case robots are going to be part of how we interact, are going to interact with us in the everyday world. And to the extent that they do it wrong, we're going to have trouble with that.
Why do we want robots instead of hiring companions?
Because there aren't enough people to go around in this country.
There are a world population problem.
We have a world population problem, but in the United States, there ain't enough young people to deal with all of us baby boomers, for example, who are coming along. There also are jobs where getting a robot to do it will be much more useful than getting a person to do it.
And I can see going to Mars and having the robot. I just don't quite get what it would be like to interact with basically a false person. How do you get emotional nourishment and social energy out of a machine?
Okay. Did you all hear that? She's saying, I don't see what would be the point in interacting with a false person that is getting emotional energy out of a machine.
I'm afraid you can't get emotional energy out of a machine. That's what you need people for, the real connection.
All right. Now I will give you a slight insight for why I think that is not true from other work that I'm doing that I did not talk about tonight. I collaborate with Professor Tim Bickmore at Northeastern University. Tim is well known for his work on what are called embodied conversational agents. These are agents that appear on computer screens. They're not robots. For behavioral change. So he's been working on how to get people to do more exercise, eat more fruits and veggies, those kinds of behavior change things. So introducing behaviors, cessation, like stopping smoking, is a even harder problem, and he's not tackled that one yet, but nonetheless. Huh? Oh, a little louder, I'm sorry. In that work, an agent takes the place of the person and has daily conversations with you about doing exercise. In the recent work that we've been doing, that agent is in fact a therapist. It's doing what's called motivational interviewing, which is a kind of therapeutic technique. And we're in fact doing studies right now, but Tim has done studies in the past. People exercise more, they maintain this regimen well with that kind of interaction. And the reason you might want to do that is because you can't afford a person to be your essentially exercise coach every day of the week, or at least I don't think I can. But a computer character is something you can do that with. And one of the things Tim has discovered is that people feel more connected and interact better when the robot has social dialogue and produces kind of emotional, sympathetic responses and all this kind of stuff. So it's very clearly a false person, but it has an effect on how people actually do things. And that's, kind of the nth version of a cycle of work that started with Reeves and Nass's work on the media equation. They've been for, 20 years now looking at people's responses to computers as social entities. And they've got more experiments than you could possibly stand to look at that show that people treat a computer, the square box, as a social entity. Not when you get to something sophisticated like the cool agent that stands there and has a face and wiggles and all that stuff, but the box that's your interface.
One more question.
Yeah, and then we can talk at coffee time. Someone back here?
Just getting back to the previous question about age-related issues with between people and robots. Have you done much research on children of various ages in the learning of conversation? also elderly persons and perhaps persons who are autistic, and how might relationships with, well, conversations with robots be effective?
I haven't. There's a lot of work going on in the human-robot interaction community, particularly on the issue of autistic children. It turns out they respond really well to robots, I guess because, well, the hypothesis is because they're so predictable. And the person who's done the lead work on that is Maya Matarik, who's at University of Southern California, if I remember right, or at one of the colleges in one of the universities in California. I may have, maybe Irvine. I can never keep straight where she is. She's done some of the lead work on that particular problem. In Japan, the Japanese robotics community, who are basically the leaders in the field, if you want to see cool robots, boy, I could show you cool robots. I mean, Asimo is in my mind, passé, compared to the robots now that look exactly like people that are around. Nonetheless, they're very interested in this issue of robots who might be companions to older people because they have such a large aging population. They're ahead of us on the curve for that. And unlike the United States, where we are very good at incorporating people from other cultures, many of whom tend to come with large families, and therefore we tend to have still a continuing youthful population, Japan is not particularly good at incorporating people from other cultures, and their own culture is at way less than zero population growth. So they're really struggling with how to deal with these problems in the next 10 and 15 years. So stay tuned, everybody.